In my last video, I mentioned the whys of why I use Livos Kunos and why it's my finish of choice. And since then, I've had a few questions about how I apply it. In this video, I'll cover my methods for applying Livos finishes. Now, to be clear, I have no skin in the game, so I absolutely do not care what finish you use for whatever reason. I use Livos for a few reasons. That's fine. You might like Viddy's hardwax oil, you might like Osmo, you might like Minwax polyurethane. My belief is that you should get good at one or two finishes and just stick with them until you have mastered them. Every finish really has its own eccentricities, and learning to master those will make you better at finishing in general. If you are constantly hopping on whatever the latest hotness of finishes are, all of your finishes will be pretty mediocre, and that's really something you shouldn't be striving for. So step 0, I guess, is surface preparation. It's the same step for all finishes really. We need to get this into a smooth state for the finish. I'll be starting at 120 grit and going all the way up to 180 grit. With Kunos you can go up to about 240 grit. Usually use 220 grit. Any higher than that and you may start running into adhesion issues in general. There's very few wood finishes that do like to be higher than that because you really want to be then sanding the finish, not the wood. But yeah, 180 grit is fine, particularly on the harder, denser woods, unless you've got a real dog's breakfast of a surface to start off with. You know, you haven't actually run it through a thicknesser or something like that. There's no reason to start with 80 grit. So 120 grit is what I'm going to go for. This is the real-time speed of sanding. Often people end up with subpar surface quality because they simply sand too fast and they're not actually sufficiently sanding the surface. Subpar preparation means that your end result is always going to be worse than it actually can be. It's also important to start the sander properly. Don't have it running, then touch the wood. That's likely to gouge it out. Instead, place it down, then switch it on. After sanding is complete, it's important to remove all the dust from the surface. A vacuum or compressed air works best. Tack cloths should never be used because they can contaminate the surface as they have an oily, waxy substance built into the cloth that just ruins everything basically. Don't use them. Prep work is done, so now to talk about the actual application process. I always store my Kunos, or all of my finishes really, in these stop-loss bags. They make the application process, actually getting the liquid out, a lot easier. Don't have the same degree of contamination if you've got a can open. Don't have to decant it into a temporary container, that sort of thing. So that's why this doesn't look like a tin of Kunos, is because it's a bag. I know some people get cheap ones off eBay that are like drink containers, that sort of thing. I don't know if they work. I don't know if they'd hold up. I've had no issue with the stop-loss bags, which are designed for solvent finishes and things like that. So your mileage may vary. Those containers might work just fine, but I haven't had any issues with the stop-loss bags. And honestly, they're not that expensive and quite reusable. For an applicator, I really quite like this Whitehall X60. So it's actually quite a big sheet. And it looks quite similar to the Scott's Shop Towels. It's a lot more durable. X60 is available in Bunnings. If you can get X80 for a good price, that's meant to be even more durable. But as you can see, the towel is actually quite large. So I chop it up into much smaller applicators. And you'll need 2 of these per coat, one to wipe it on, one to wipe it off. Mixed up the Kunos, it's nice and combined, nothing separated. And I could just pour it straight on. I've always found that pouring the finish on leaves usually one section where you've poured it onto a little bit darker. It's much easier to manage if you just put it onto the applicator. If you've got it in a tray, you just dip it on and wipe across. I know for some finishes, people like to dump it in the middle and use like a credit card or a plastic scraper to put it all over the place. I haven't had much luck with that. This video is really about my methods for applying it, so ignore those people, I guess. So we just fold our applicator over, squeeze out a bit onto it. Oh, that's way too much. That's why I shouldn't talk while I'm doing this. And we're just rubbing that into the surface. Now the main thing with the wipe all is it doesn't leave lint behind, it doesn't absorb too much finish, so you're actually getting the product down onto the surface. And it doesn't degrade too quickly, whereas the Scott's towels I found tend to degrade a little bit quicker than I'd like. And that's dripping all over, so I'm going to stop talking now. Once the entire surface is coated, I'll set a timer for 15 minutes to wipe off the excess. The end grain will absorb it like nobody's business, so you probably need to come back a few times during the first application and apply a few extra coats of it. Again, you want it nice and thin, just like everywhere else, but that will absorb pretty quickly into the end grain. With the overhead lights off, I've got a low raking light to see any dry spots, which are around here. And likewise, I'll look for any spots that are a little bit too wet. Try and get the surface as even as possible, so put some more oil on these dry spots. Then we'll need to let it sit for about 15 minutes. That low raking light was just this video panel light, nothing special. You could use this, you could use a little torch, something that you can get down low, almost parallel with the surface, and you'll see defects a lot better, or spots that you've missed. Highly recommend getting something, doesn't matter what type of finishing you're doing, low raking light reveals a lot of sins. And that's my 15-minute timer. We need to take a clean piece of cloth applicator and need to wipe off any of the excess. This is the thing that got me most confused when I first started using oil finishes. You hear people say, you know, remove the excess after 15 minutes. And this was primarily YouTubers, so the explanations weren't great. They were flooding the surface and then wiping off the excess. So more than half the finish never actually stayed on. In this case, for the Livos, we're applying a very thin coat. We want it to look just maybe a tiny bit wet. We're not flooding the surface. So there's actually very little that gets wiped off. But it is important to wipe it off after that 15 minutes or so for the first coat, because it can impede the curing process. So the stuff on the surface cures, but the stuff in the wood doesn't. So the end result typically feels like a little bit greasy rather than a nice soft finish when it's all said and done. So this is a very important step. And we're pressing down hard and removing finish. You can see that there's a bit left over on the rag. The idea is this should feel almost dry to the touch after it's absorbed in, because that's all that's actually going to be absorbed in this first coat. It also helps smooth out any streaks, any bits where you might have put on a bit too much finish, and evens out the whole thing. So now we wait about 12 hours for this to cure, and then we can move on to the second coat and any touch-ups we need to do along the way, which I'll cover in 12 hours time. Remember, this is an oil finish, so don't scrunch up your rags and leave them to dry out. Lay them flat on concrete outside or in water or something like that. Otherwise they can self-combust, and no one really wants that. So it's been about 20 hours. It was a bit chilly overnight, so I left it a little bit longer. It's nice and dry now. It's very smooth. If I wasn't happy with the smoothness at this point because of either dust nibs or some sort of contaminant that got into the finish, or maybe you didn't wipe it off quite as evenly as you should, I like to use these non-woven abrasives. This happens to be Fleece, V-L-I-E-S, which is a weird way to spell fleece, by Festool, which is actually made by Sia. That's a whole different story. This is the grey grit, which is 800 grit equivalent, and just some very gentle strokes back and forth, just to denib it, and that's all I do. Then you come back and wipe it off, or any of the debris you've just taken care of, but the surface for this has come up fine, so I don't actually need to do that. But yeah, don't use anything more abrasive than that, and you really don't want to be abrading too much off. That should be all you need to do. So for the next coat, the process is pretty much exactly the same. We're applying less finish this time, and we're just letting it wait for 5 minutes instead of 15 minutes before we wipe it back. And it's kind of to fill in anything we didn't get in the first coat and build it up just very, very slightly. It says nice thin coat like before, except this time we're just leaving it for 5 minutes instead of 15, and we'll wipe it off again. Just as before, we're just wiping this off. Overall, we've probably used about half as much finish as we did on the first coat. When we do the third, it'll be half as much again. So I'll leave that for another 12 hours or so. So probably this time tomorrow, and we'll get our third and final coat on. Can't really apply more than 3 coats. I've found it tends to just not bond after a certain point unless you scuff sand it back a little bit. The process is exactly the same. Wipe it on, then wipe it off. However, we're having a much reduced volume. We're going to be using about a tablespoon's worth for the tabletop, bench top. And instead of waiting 15 or 5 minutes to wipe it off, once I get to one end, wipe it off. So wipe back and forth, and then I'll start at this end wiping it off. So meant to do it basically immediately, 60 seconds type thing. And that works pretty well. Again, it'll be another 12 hours to dry. And then we are more or less done. And just like before, to wipe that off, starting on this side, bit of pressure, clean rag, not much is coming off, exactly what we want. Going with the grain, that keeps any lines in line with the grain. It would be much smoother visually and to the touch surface. And it's barely wet. Not much has come off, which is what we want. Leave that for 12 more hours since it's about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That's not going to be too much of a hassle. Then it's pretty much done. That's 3 coats done on the bench top, and it is feeling very smooth and looks great to the eye too. If there were some dust nibs, you'd hear some variation in the sounds, and I would burnish them off using a cloth or hessian or brown paper bag, and that would smooth everything back. But it's smooth, so I don't need to do that. Some of you, maybe a little bit more eagle-eyed, will point out all the flaws in the finish and go, wow, it really looks like you've been beating it up, you know, using it as an outfeed table in an active woodworking shop, assembling cabinets on it and all that garbage. But clearly it's a piece of furniture, so I'd never do that. And it's just my poor finishing skills. This sample here is the same species, so this is all Vic Ash, and you can see the oil has brought out a little bit more colour, so this is definitely why I use oil finishes over water finishes. I want to talk a little bit about stains. This is, let's consider it bonus content because I'm not that well versed with stains, so I will touch on the subject, but I'm not claiming to be an expert at it. Kunos can work with a range of stains. They have 2, or Livos have 2 stains that are compatible, Caldet and tinted Kunos. I'm sure it could work with some other tints like trans tint or non-grain raising dyes, that sort of thing. Something that seals off the wood is going to be problematic for any of the Livos products, as they really like to bond into the wood. So your mileage may vary with different products. I do have some samples of both Kunos and Caldet, and yes, they come in these adorable baby food jars. They actually go quite far. I have mahogany in Kunos and rosewood in Caldet. Now, Caldet is not really a top coat, but it will work underneath Kunos. It is more interior than exterior, while Kunos can be used sort of a little bit of both. And the tinted Kunos applies exactly the same. Actually, both of these products apply exactly the same. You can treat it exactly the same as the Kunos, but obviously the tinted Kunos needs less work done because it's a top coat all in one. Starting with the tinted Kunos, again, this is mahogany. I'm going to apply some to the wood, which again is Vic Ash. One complaint I would have of this is it's not a super vibrant tint. You can do multiple coats, but it doesn't tend to get much darker. So I'd set a timer for that, then wipe it off after 15 minutes or so. The next day, this is plenty dry. I could apply another coat of the Caldet if I wanted to, or Kunos straight over the top as a protective coat. Applying another coat of stain will make it a little bit darker, but not incredibly darker, as it doesn't really build the colour all that much in my experience. Now, the colours aren't coming through entirely clearly on camera, so it is something that you'd want to get samples of for yourself to see how that works if you are actually interested in those type of finishes. For an out feed table, this is a ridiculously luxurious finish, which probably won't hold up all that well for workshop use, but it is really easy to reapply and repair the finish if I want to do so. The colour it imparts and the touch make me happy because it just feels and looks so nice. And this is my method for applying finishes. It's very low stress, easy to apply finish, so it makes me happy. And if you've got a better way that is better for you, that makes you happy on this finish or on a different finish, do that, because don't introduce extra stress through your finish, and then you'll have the best finish, the one that hasn't made you sad the whole time. Thanks for watching.